Hi, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on next generation assessment in higher education. I'm Tammie Cumming. I'm the Associate Provost for Institutional Effectiveness at CUNY's Brooklyn College. I'm joined by my colleagues, David Miller from the University of Florida and Terry Rhodes from AAQEP. Thank you for joining us as we talk about this exciting development in higher education. Next slide, please. I thought I would set the context of where we've been and where we're going. So if we look back in time, and I reference the work of Peter Ewell, who's done so much work in this area. If we take a look at the decade from 1999 to 2009, we can look at the assessment work that was being done when it was still relatively new. There were some faculty criticisms that it felt a little prescriptive from the accreditor's perspective. And we were still seeing a lot of student learning outcomes that were assessed with indirect methods of assessment. So having students self-report how they've learned things in the classroom with respect to their courses and their degree programs. In 2010, in the next decade, we started to see things evolve. There was an emphasis on direct measures of assessment. So now we're taking a look at what the authority is saying about the student learning outcomes. As we worked for 10 years trying to build meaningful assessment, we evolved into what we're now calling the next generation of assessment. Assessment where the faculty are driving the process and it's much more meaningful to them. Next slide, please. So when I take a look at accreditation throughout the years, I'm seeing assessment is required back in between 1999 and 2009. So there's attention being paid to this very important part of higher education learning, considered one of the best practices, a high impact practice. George Koo talked a lot about this. And they were starting to talk about the indirect and direct measures. While institutions were not all doing the direct method of assessment in that decade, we did see a shift in accreditation requirements where learning outcomes improvement is now the focus. And they wanted that to be incorporated with mostly direct measures of assessment. They also were calling for systematic assessment. No more scurrying right before the accreditor comes for the visit to do the assessment and say how your students are doing. They wanted to see something that is systematic, that is documented, where people are actively, continuously assessing and working on improving their programs for their various constituents. Moving now towards what we call next generation assessment, we're really realizing that context matters. If this is going to be meaningful work, if this is going to be incorporated into the faculty's curriculum and meaning for the faculty, we have to consider the context, which has been so refreshing about AAQEP actually, because they value the context of the institution and going through the accreditation process. Next slide, please. So assessment for accreditation, really, we're seeing the standards have evolved. There's a focus on student learning outcomes. Faculty are definitely getting more involved. You have people running the assessment offices that have an understanding that this has to be, if this is going to be sustainable and efficient, this has to be faculty driven. And, you know, we've all seen those articles that have come out in the Chronicle where faculty are saying, don't just give me some items to put on a test that aren't really relevant for me or for me to assess my course. They want to actually be involved. And if they can understand the importance of the assessment, then they're more likely to participate. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk very briefly about what we did at my institution when I was at the New York City College of Technology, CUNY. We launched an initiative to create assessment for learning. So I put that in italics because there was really a movement for the direction that we are conducting assessments to improve the student learning. We really cared about getting direct measures, faculty conducting an assessment, capstone level, various ways to do the assessments, but no longer an emphasis on the indirect assessment. During my tenure, these 10 years at New York City College of Technology, we came from being on a warning to being commended. And really, it started with the faculty. So in those 9 years, from 2009 to 2018, we saw a huge shift, but it took a long time to get there. It wasn't something that I started, walked in the door and said, hey, assessment is great. And people came running for me. Actually, when I first walked in the door and I came from a testing background at ACT, the college test, I said assessment and people started going the other direction. I thought, wait, they're not as excited about this as I have been in my professional life when I was at ACT. So I understood very quickly that I had to educate our faculty into what good assessment practice would be and how it's meaningful for them and for their students and for the institution and for their programs and departments. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we did was we showed how everything really fit and aligned together. We had courses aligned with the programs. They were doing curriculum maps. We could see how the programs supported the mission of our institution or college, and how, if you're in a system, how those colleges supported the mission of the system. The context matters. Next slide, please. In this work that we did during my 10 years at City Tech, or New York City College of Technology, the one thing that I tuned into was when I was having meaningful conversations with faculty, I brought up 3 key areas in my field of educational measurement that I look to in doing educational research, doing assessment, doing evaluation work. And those 3 things are validity, reliability, and fairness. And I quickly understood that when faculty can see that there is a science, that there is a method behind the work that we're doing, that there is a real purpose, and you can actually see improvements on so many levels with the student learning outcomes. And also we started to see increases in retention, increases in graduation rates. We started to get their attention. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. It took a while. It took a lot of work in getting the faculty to be educated for why these things are important. But I would say that was really the pivotal moment at that institution, and probably why we were commended by our regional accreditor, Middle States. So with that, I will be handing off to my colleague, David Miller.
Well, thank you, Tammie. I guess what I wanted to talk a little bit about next then was that when we think about next generation assessment, we're really talking about what we believe is now a new form of the way we do assessment and the way we think about assessment. And so in the next few slides, I basically want to talk about what are some of the key differences, some of the changes that we have seen in assessment. And one of the first things that's been talked about by Tammie some, and again, I want to just echo the importance of, is that faculty have become much more important in the assessment process. We've moved from a situation where we have faculty who often expected someone else to come in and do the assessment or to purchase off the assessments that already existed, to a role where faculty now are seeing the importance and the uses of assessment. And so they have a much more increased role. And that, of course, means that the faculty are involved in that assessment process. They're involved from the development of the assessment to the implementation of the assessment, to scoring of it, to summarizing and reporting, and to learning what to do with that assessment and how it can be used. So there's a lot more training going on that we're seeing. And so one of the big keys here is we see our university and many other universities are working much more on empowering faculty to be involved in that assessment process. One of the second things that we've seen, and I think largely due to the pandemic, but I think that in a lot of ways universities and colleges were moving in that direction already anyway, is that we have moved much more online. We've moved more online with our instruction. We've moved more online with the assessment. And that online move has meant that there's had a number of major changes to the ways that we do assessments. First of all, that one of the things that's going on is that the old methods of assessment, where we sat them down in a classroom and we watched and we knew what the students were doing and we didn't have to worry about the issues of cheating as much because we could watch it and we felt we had some control over it, has changed. And so now we actually have new forms of assessment, new methods. We're much less likely to use multiple choice items as frequently, for example. So we have different types and different forms of assessment that are going on that really are matching the learning outcomes, and also at the same time can be done online. So in addition to that, we're also thinking that we have new ways and different ways of actually thinking about the quality of those assessments. That is, the issues of validity, reliability, and fairness have not gone away at all. But sometimes the ways that we think about it and the kinds of methods that we're using are going to vary here some. And finally, the third issue that I think has been, that we've seen a lot about is, and by the way, an issue that people are not all in agreement about what to do about yet, is this issue of privacy, the issue of whether or not there's cheating, whether or not there's plagiarism. There's lots of new technologies that allow us to look at that more closely, but we're also sometimes concerned that some universities are less likely to use that kind of technology. I know that at UF, where I'm working, that we use technology all the time to check for plagiarism and even cheating and things like that. But I know that the university that Tammie's at, we've talked about this, is more likely to err on the side of privacy and making sure that you're protecting the individual rights of the students and not looking as much at those issues of cheating and plagiarism. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about assessment now that it is all online. So the third issue, and certainly related to the others, once again, is that the psychometrics is going to be looking at some very different ways of looking at the assessments. Again, the standards for educational psychological testing has laid out what is 3 foundations for looking at assessment: validity, reliability, and fairness. And those are not going to change at all. And their importance, of course, I think is evident to most of us who are in the testing profession. But what's not clear is just how we're going to be able to make sure we're still applying these concepts when we look at these new and different forms of assessment. Just as an example, there's just quite a few ways that we're going to see changes in here, but validity, for example, which is been identified, of course, as the most important part of the assessment and deals with interpretations and uses of assessments. It's still going to be important that we have expert judgment. I think that content and having experts look at the assessments is not going to go away at all. This issue of alignment of what's being tested with the SLOs will not change. On the other hand, new forms of assessments mean that we're also going to have a clear focus on the response process, the ways in which we're collecting data, and the types of items that we're seeing out there. And so we're going to have to look at the actual forms of the assessment and whether they also align with the SLO. So that's certainly a new thing. It's also become clear that when we go online and we start working with our colleagues, that there's more and more opportunities, and it's become much simpler in some ways because we're all interconnected to have greater collaboration in this assessment process. And so we're learning a lot more from each other as we go through this process. It's going to affect the interpretability and uses of the assessments. Reliability is another one that we expect to see some changes on. And again, this is simply the consistency of measurement or trying to minimize the amount of measurement error that we see in these assessments. But with the use of online assessments, it means that we're going to have a lot more data potentially. It's a matter very simply that people are going to be able to store that data and analyze that data, that software is going to become more available. And so we're going to also see broader use of SLOs that mean that we have more data where multiple programs might be using the same learning outcomes. You know, critical thinking has become very central over the last several years. And that's something that is applicable, of course, across multiple disciplines. And so now we have much larger data sets and the need to actually look at expertise of people being able to score those kinds of systems out there. So what we expect to see are perhaps an emphasis on some different forms of reliability than we've seen in the past, and some different types of information we're going to look at, and all of that is going to be, of course, more simply done by the fact that the data is already up there, it is online, it's available, and the software will continue to grow so that we'll be able to look at these issues of reliability, which has often been a little bit tricky to the average faculty member in the past. The third issue, of course, is fairness. And with fairness, all we're really talking about here is that no student should be disadvantaged based on personal characteristics unrelated to the SLOs. And so now what we're looking at is an environment where we have become more and more concerned with the new forms of assessment and the new environments for assessment, with making sure that we have an inclusive environment. This environment means it needs to be inclusive to students. When we think about how we bring students into our educational programs, we're much more concerned about bringing in a broad range and diversity of the students, but we're also interested in the same thing for our faculty and making sure that they represent a broader environment of personal characteristics out there. The other thing is that's going to be of concern for fairness is whether or not we have taken a close look at the admissions processes and the curriculum and things that really guarantee that students have an equal opportunity to learn. And that, of course, comes back to that alignment between the assessments and the SLOs. So we're going to have expert reviews of assessments. We're going to be able to examine issues that are similar to validity and reliability, but then ensure that the validity and reliability really are equal for each subpopulation that's of concern to us.
Thanks, David. I think that's really helpful. And we thought at this point in our talk, if we could discuss the handout that hopefully you've all received and talk about the institutionalization of assessment and maybe stepping back and doing a self-evaluation of where you are in your program. David definitely highlighted the importance of the centrality of the faculty, having administration support. And at my institution, there's a lot of emphasis, and many institutions, assessment results linked to the budget prioritization. So if I can just share my screen, then we can take a look at that evaluation document that my team and the team has come up with on this presentation. So thank you to David and Terry for helping me present this to you. So here's the form that hopefully you have already received and had an opportunity to take a look at before or now during our session. And what we've put together is our best practices. We've worked with many institutions on their assessment for accreditation, for professional accreditation, for regional accreditation. And some of the best practices we've come up with include administrative support. As David mentioned, centrality of faculty is so important, making sure that they're really the leads, because that data, if they're going to use this information to improve their programs, they're the authority, as David has already mentioned. Continuous improvement, making sure that there's a systematic way of conducting these assessments, having people accountable for conducting the assessments. Communication with stakeholders, that's so important, including the students in some of the decisions that we're making. Taking a look at what our alumni are telling us, talking to our advisory boards, talking to our administration. And institutional planning. I think this is so important and sometimes left off of the list when evaluating an assessment system, and making sure that there's alignment of the assessment with the strategic planning goals and strategies. I think that's very, very important. And also that the assessment results are used to set goals for the programs and major initiatives that are forthcoming. So I hope when we finish this presentation and we move into the question portion of the talk, you might have some discussion topics around this instrument. So thank you for letting me share this. And you've heard from me talking about a local perspective. You've heard from David talking about the importance of next gen assessment. And Terry's going to talk about the national perspective on assessment. So I'll turn it over to Terry and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Tammie and David. As Tammie said, I'm going to try to put some of what we've been talking about into the more general trends that we're finding at the Association of American Colleges and Universities that are happening nationally across regional accrediting bodies as well as professional accrediting bodies. And the two of those sets of organizations that are charged with accreditation and in essence also engaged with ensuring the quality of learning that is occurring are coming closer and closer together in terms of what it is they're looking for and how institutions are expected to respond. Next, please. So why are we talking about a next generation assessment? Well, clearly part of the impetus for this that accreditors are feeling, but institutions and faculty and students as well, is there's increased political pressure. And to that, I would probably add social and economic pressure as well around accountability and justifying the preparation of students for work and the work that higher education is engaged in and why it is necessary for us in higher ed to do what we do in order to prepare students for success after their education with us is completed. And the way in which we see things merging in particular has been an evolution that Tammie sort of walked us through a bit, is broadly defined learning outcomes. There has been this movement toward learning outcomes, but often those have been translated into specific outcomes associated with the learning in a specific discipline or field of study. And what is now emerging is a set of learning outcomes that seem to be pervasive across disciplines and disciplinary differences in schools that are linked to the success of our graduates, regardless of the field and the occupation in which they move or find themselves upon graduation with a degree or with some other type of certificate or credentials. And in particular, one of the things that we are finding is that students' ability to communicate what they have learned is getting to be more and more important. One of the things that AACNU does every couple years is that we conduct a nationwide study, a survey of employers, the employers who are hiring the graduates and the folks who are finishing credentials at our institutions. And one of the resounding responses that we find, regardless of whether we're talking to a CEO or a hiring level person, whether it is an international business or employer, or whether it is a local or a nonprofit employer, is that they say students need to be able to talk to them about the learning that they have accumulated and gathered during their education and what that learning looks like. They also surprisingly, and this report will be out actually, it's about to be released as this session is going live, that the transcript that has been the bread and butter of graduates and their ability to show their learning and to demonstrate it are less and less meaningful and utilized by employers to make decisions about who to hire. And increasingly, they are saying, in particular, there is an age difference. Younger folks who are in these employer categories are saying a portfolio of student work is more and more valued because it allows the hiring person, the employer, to actually see the work that students have done and make their own judgment about the quality of that work. Especially, and it is enhanced when a student can also describe the quality of that work. And if those two things match, i.e. the student's assessment, an indirect measure that we used to rely upon, and the actual examples of work, the direct measure of the student's learning match, that's a person they want to hire. Next, please. So how do we help students see learning? And I'm using students here to mean both our students who are experiencing this education as they move through our institutions and our programs, but also faculty to start to see themselves as students in how they're learning to engage in this new next generation set of expectations around learning. Next, please. Essential learning outcomes have become the shorthand name for the kinds of learning outcomes. David mentioned critical thinking, that everyone seems to be looking for students to be able to demonstrate regardless of their major, regardless of their field of study. And again, building on this notion of a portfolio or being able to see the direct and the indirect, increasingly faculty are learning that they need to engage students in things like high impact practices. Again, it's a shorthand term for things such as internships, senior projects, problem-based learning, group team learning. These are all things that ask students to demonstrate their knowledge and what they have learned, and to apply it in particular circumstances, to know what to do with what they've learned. Many of the measures we had before are what the student thought they learned, or our judgment about their mastery of a content area, but we were not delving into, do they understand what that allows them to do and when to use it and how to use it. This becomes particularly important in terms of the second part of the essential learning that we need to help our students learn as they move through our years and time with them. And that is really around equity and inclusive excellence. We're living in a time that is hard to avoid noticing that we're having to come to grips with racial reckoning. That so many of the best practices that we've once referred to, including our assessment practices, are best practices for dealing with a population of students that has been predominantly white and often predominantly privileged in terms of the students who are coming to our classes and that we have been working with. Now we have to think about the kinds of students that we are handling now and are expecting to have a higher education, that the equity, the makeup of that student body is substantially different. The age range of our students is substantially different. The backgrounds, the generational differences, whether they have a history of family coming to college and not, those who have not gone to college coming back, who tried it, stepped out, are coming back. We have to be much more inclusive. If for no other reason, if we're not paying attention to social justice issues, but just from an economic standpoint, we have to be much more inclusive and responsive. And that's part of why I talk about faculty as students, because I was a faculty member for 20 years before coming to the association world. I had to learn as well how to change my practices, my pedagogical assumptions, to make it more inclusive of the students who are in my courses. Next, please. We have goals that we all start out with. Many institutions do indeed have equity goals that they're trying to achieve. This is again one of the surveys our association has done of chief academic officers. And you see on the left percentage of them saying, yes, we have equity goals for our campus or our program. You can see the percentages. They're not particularly impressive, but when we press them further about, and do you actually then look to see if those goals are being achieved, and do you disaggregate what you're finding to make sure that all of those groups of students that you're trying to reach are actually getting the quality education that you're looking for. Even fewer percentage, a smaller percentage, indicate that they're actually using the data they have and disaggregating it. So we have a need, I think, an imperative to make much more of this explicit. And through our assessment practices, we're starting to do that. And that's part of what next generation assessment is about, as David alluded to, with the addition of fairness as being one of those key principles in driving assessment these days. Next, please. So what are the practices that help us verify the achievement that we're looking for? Next, please. We're looking at practices that allow us to move across all of these different areas of study, all of these foci that bring our students back to our institutions, and across all levels, from introductory to more advanced work. And the thing that pops out again and again in terms of the work that was evolving, as Tammie described it, over the last couple decades, is a growing focus on the actual work that students are producing. They produce it in response to the assignments that faculty give and to the expectations that we have for that. And so increasingly, we can focus on that work. That also helps us from an economic standpoint, in that we don't have to get anything additional or new per se, because it's the work that's already being produced. It is the work that we as faculty use for part of our assessment, i.e. the mastery of the content that we're interested in. That's something that we are grading, and we're developing ways to grade that. We have those solidly in place, but now we're also looking for a way to assess these cross-cutting skills and abilities: critical thinking, teamwork, analysis, quantitative literacy, written oral communication. Next, please. I bring forth here the Value Institute, which is part of AAC&U, because it helps bring some of these trends together to try to address next generation assessment. It rests upon rubrics, in particular the value rubrics that have been developed specifically for those cross-cutting learning outcomes, such as critical thinking. And part of what, building on the importance of context, that the Value Institute is attempting to do is two main things to help faculty, programs, and institutions. One is to try to lay out a nationwide landscape of learning. Where are our students learning? How are they learning? What is the quality of that learning? Looking across 2- and 4-year, public and private, research institutions, faith-based institutions, et cetera. Is there a landscape out there, highs and lows, strengths and weaknesses, and mapping that so that we have a larger context to consider what we're finding more locally. The second major thing is external validation. We use the rubrics to actually score student work using the rubric, and to assign a score to it that is related to the quality of the learning. How sophisticated, how advanced is it or not? And that allows us to look at introductory level to advanced level and see whether or not our students are learning as they make their way through whatever their field of study is. But it also provides a learning situation for faculty as a student to know how to use a rubric. They're familiar with it for grading, but they're not as familiar with rubrics for this broader cross-cutting ability to judge the underlying skills and abilities, such as critical thinking, to put their own judgment locally in their own context in this broader nationwide generic context that can be disaggregated around type of institution, year in school, credit hours earned by students, et cetera, to create the context for placing your own work within that. Next, please. So what are the lessons learned from this work? We have a report that again is about to come out called The Emerging Landscape of Learning. So if you'll hit your advanced, thank you. And you could run through all of these, David, and I'll talk about each of them. Is that, again, we're talking about that context, and a landscape is part of that because it allows us to position ourselves, our students, our programs, our missions for our institutions. It's not that you're horrible or good, failure or succeeding, but rather you have a broad, rich context to consider what you're doing and to pose questions that you want to pose and answer about the quality of what you're doing, where your strengths are, and where you need improvements. That means that you have to have that local data. The local data are critical and the landscape is critical. It's the juxtaposition of the two that allows it to be more robust. And it allows us to deconstruct and disaggregate. David talked about more and more data. This is giving us more data, more systematic data, and it allows us to then ask those questions about equity. It allows us to ask those questions about what's working and what's not working. Not individual faculty judgments in things or program, but rather disaggregating the learning outcome. Because critical thinking isn't a single thing. It is comprised of a series of dimensions that the rubric can capture and help us know where to better focus our attention. It's interdisciplinary and integrated. It is saying no one course provides the learning that students need. The way students learn, how any of us learn, is through continual practice and iterative engagement with the learning outcomes that we're interested in. To look at them in, I mentioned problem-based learning. Being able to learn something in one problem context and be able to transfer it into a new one, that's where you pick up knowledge in a different course, in a different field, but you still have the underlying skills about how to dissect a problem and begin to answer it. And faculty have to be at the center of that. They grade and take care of the content part of it. Now they're also able to look at why that content may or may not have been mastered as well as one hoped, because they didn't have the skills for doing the integration, to doing the analysis. And that's going to help the quality of learning across an individual student, a program, and the institution. Next, please. So what we're really talking about in next generation assessment is that we are being asked to shift. It's sort of where Tammie and David started this conversation. We have to start to think about and work in the technology and the next generation approaches, move us from just my work to seeing it as part of our work. No single person or office or position or assessment can tell us the story we need to know or have our students learn at the levels we want them to. We all have to be engaged. And this is one of the ways, by looking at essential learning and tools that allow us to look at it across disciplines and instances, are how we're going to get to the quality levels that we need. So I'm now going to turn this back to, I believe, Tammie.
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and we're ready to talk to all of you about the questions that you have.